Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Creating an NIH Data Management and Sharing Plan with ICPSR. We're so excited for you to join us. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we're going to run through today. I'm Kirani Simon. I'll be your co-host, and I'll be supporting my coworkers as they present some awesome material for you all. We are first going to start off with a review of the NIH data sharing policy and the role ICPSR plays. Then we're going to do a fun hands-on session, crafting a DMS plan. It's going to be some interactive breakout rooms. And we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back to the concurrent sessions. And then finally, we're going to wrap up for some Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen and pass it over to Chelsea and Sarah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. Again, as Kirani said, we're sorry for the slight delay, but we're going to get going and speed along as fast as we can here so we have time for everything in the agenda today. So in this first part of the presentation, myself and Sarah are going to cover a brief overview of the 2023 NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy, and we're going to walk you through creating a DMS plan to meet the requirements of the NIH data submission, the NIH grant submission process specifically. So there are some differences between what NIH requires and what some other agencies require. My name is Chelsea Sample-Steele. I am a project manager, and I am joined as well by my colleague Sarah Rush, another project manager here at ICPSR. Both of us manage NIH-sponsored archives. The archive that I work on is the National Addiction and HIV Data Archive Program, or NADAP, and Sarah works on the Data Sharing for Demographic Research, or DSDR, archive here at ICPSR. We work with many NIH researchers to share their data, and so if you have specific questions about those archives, we're happy to meet with you at some other point, but today we're going to cover things more generally for ICPSR and the NIH data sharing policy. So prior to the workshop, we sent out a list of resources with 3 items that were required reading, and we hope you are all able to take a look at those before we meet today. These included the NIH policy itself, the actual text of the policy. NIH is writing a data management and sharing plan webpage, which goes into detail on what to include in your DMS plan for each of the required elements of the plan. And the third was an example NIH-funded project description, which we are going to use for an activity during this portion of the day. I wanted to send these ahead of time because we're actually going to spend a little less time going over the policy details this morning and more time in breakout rooms and discussion on writing a data management and sharing plan. So for more details on the things we cover today, you can refer back to the links listed on the previous slide or in your email. So first, for a brief overview of the 2023 Data Management and Sharing Policy. As of January 25th, 2023, NIH requires all investigators to submit a data management and sharing plan with their grant applications. The goal of the policy is to maximize data sharing by NIH investigators. Data sharing enables increased transparency around research findings, reuse of hard-to-collect data, and data set linkages or combinations that otherwise may not be possible. The expectation is that most NIH-funded scientific data will be shared, and even when data cannot be shared, all of it will be managed, meaning all investigators who propose to collect data will be expected to follow this data management and sharing plan process. The policy applies to all research funded in whole or in part by NIH, which generates scientific data. The policy lists certain activities that would or would not be considered scientific data, and there is more on that on the next slide. So here is directly pulled from the NIH website, more information on what they mean by scientific data. So you can see examples here of what award types and activities the policy does and does not apply to. The policy does apply to research projects, K awards, SBIR and STTR awards, and research centers. And there are a number of things here that it does not apply to. Next slide. So NIH defines the data management and sharing plan as a plan describing the data management, preservation, and sharing of scientific data and accompanying metadata, and says that the plan should outline how scientific data and any accompanying metadata will be managed and shared, taking into account any potential restrictions or limitations on that sharing. Next slide. On the under the new policy, you're able to include costs for data management, curation, and preservation in your budget proposal. This includes costs for managing data that you do locally on your end, as well as costs to have data curated or archived through a repository or multiple repositories. NIH has also identified costs that you should not include in your data management and sharing budget, including infrastructure costs such as facilities and administrative costs, and routine research costs such as data collection or data access fees. So as a very brief overview, you have the full text of the policy you can refer back to, but we wanted to move on to the most important part of this session today for this part of our day, which is the specific details about the 6 required elements that NIH lists out as being required in your data management and sharing plan. So first, a couple of additional details. The NIH Data Management Plan should be no longer than 2 pages long. It should reflect the research team's plans around data management, sharing, transparency, and reuse for all data produced, and it should not include hyperlinks or URLs. The plan should include the 6 elements that are listed here on this slide, including data type, related tools, software or code, standards, data preservation, access and associated timelines, and access distribution or reuse considerations, and oversight of data management and sharing. We'll go through each of these separately in the upcoming slides, including how to respond to each one, as well as information about ICPSR that is relevant to each element, so that if you are planning to share your data with ICPSR or one of ICPSR's NIH-sponsored archives, you will have some ready-made information to include in your plan. So let's start with element 1, data type. The information here in the How to Respond column is drawn from the NIH data sharing website and reflects ICPSR's understanding of what NIH is generally looking for in each element. So some of this information could potentially vary depending on what particular institute or center you're working with, but this is from the overall NIH policy. In general, you want to respond to the data type element with information about the types and amount of data that will be generated, what data will be shared or not shared given any ethical, legal, or technical limitations, and any metadata and documentation that will be produced alongside those data. Given this, there's some information about ICPSR here that you may wish to include in your data management plan if you are planning to archive with ICPSR. So regarding data types, ICPSR accepts a wide range of data types, including quantitative, qualitative, geospatial, image, and video data. And we do have a collection development policy if you have questions about whether your data are a good fit for ICPSR. ICPSR manages access to confidential data elements through its restricted data dissemination practices. So if you're concerned about any ethical or confidentiality related reasons for not sharing data, we do have restricted data dissemination practices available that can help ease those concerns. And ICPSR produces codebooks and other study documentation and metadata that you provide will be made available on the ICPSR website alongside your data. The next element is related tools, software, and code. In this section, you're asked to describe any tools or software that are required to access or manipulate the data that you're sharing. For the ICPSR-related information regarding software types, ICPSR will release the data that you provide in a suite of formats to allow for the greatest possible accessibility of the data. So we typically include SPSS, SAS, Stata, R, and ASCII, and delimited formats in any study that we release, even if you've only provided the data in one of those formats. ICPSR is also able to publish code or syntax from merging, linking, or other data manipulations alongside your data, and we encourage you to submit that code to us when it would be helpful for secondary users of your data. And we're also able to link to your code if it's in another platform, and we can link to it within the study metadata that we produce. Element 3 is standards, including describing any applicable standards for organizing and accessing the data and metadata, such as formats, metadata standards, and others. ICPSR follows, for the ICPSR information, we follow the Data Documentation Initiative, or DDI, metadata standard for all of our data. And the We also use controlled vocabulary to ensure consistency across all of the studies that we release. These two things will facilitate the findability and accessibility of the data, of your data on our website. And there's a link here for more information about metadata standards that we use at ICPSR. I should also note that these slides will be shared with you after the presentation. So there's a lot of embedded links here, but you'll have access to all of this information after. So the next element is data preservation, access, and associated timelines. In this element, you will need to share details about the name of the repository where your data will be archived, how the data will be made findable and identifiable, when the data will be made available and for how long. And so just a quick note is that NIH expects that the data are shared no later than the publication or the end of the award for data underlying findings not published in peer-reviewed journals, whichever comes first. So if you're going to publish on your data, the NIH policy says that your data must be available at the time that that publication is available. Under the ICPSR information section here, ICPSR is one of NIH's designated and accepted repositories. We permanently archive deposited files. And so since this is permanent archiving, to pay for archiving at ICPSR, you're just budgeting for upfront costs. There is no perpetual cost over time for storage or anything like that. Regarding the timeline, ICPSR will curate and release the data as quickly as able upon receipt of the files, with the understanding that time from receipt to release can depend on the size, quality, and condition of the data that we receive, the extent of curation, and the number of data collections in our queue for processing. And regarding how the data will be findable and identifiable, all data that we release are accessed on the ICPSR website, and researchers can use our robust website search tools to search for data or variables of interest, thanks to the metadata that we populate for each study. There are a couple of additional ICPSR notes that I wanted to include on the next slide, please. Back 2 slides. Sorry. This one, yeah.
Okay.
One. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know there's they kind of look all the same. So all of the data that we release at ICPSR receive a digital object identifier, or DOI, which is a unique persistent identifier that ensures the data are permanently identifiable. And as I've noted before, data released by ICPSR have metadata in DDI format, and both study level metadata and also variable level metadata, and this further enhances findability and discoverability of your data. Next slide. So the next plan element is access, distribution, or reuse considerations. In this part of your data management and sharing plan, you will need to describe the informed consent, privacy, and confidentiality protections, laws or regulations, and any other considerations that may limit the extent of data sharing. You also need to state any plan to communicate this limitation to organizations that will preserve and share the scientific data. So to address confidentiality issues, ICPSR does have some things that we do during the curation process. So we conduct a disclosure risk review of all data, the results of which will inform the appropriate restrictions to place upon access to the data. ICPSR also makes available via public use, the data that are made available via public use files require registration and agreement to ICPSR terms of use. And data made available via restricted use require an application process that includes a restricted data use agreement and other elements of the application before access is granted. So we do have tiers of access to restricted data based on data sensitivity that we can provide. All of this is to say, if you have concerns about privacy or confidentiality in your data that would not make them appropriate for an immediate public release, we have options available to help you still be able to share those data safely. Next slide. And also I wanted to note that this plan element also includes additional considerations for addressing human subjects protections, which are listed here during the informed consent process. We wanted to point you to ICPSR's guidance on informed consent language, which will help you communicate to data participants or people that are signing the informed consent that the data will be shared, and how you can do that effectively. Okay, next slide. The last plan element is oversight of data management and sharing. And in this element, you will need to describe how compliance with the DMS plan will be monitored and managed, the frequency of oversight, and by whom at your institution the oversight will be done. And ICPSR recommends that you identify an individual or individuals on your research team who will be primarily responsible for ensuring appropriate data management and sharing protocols and practices. The people that we interact with at ICPSR about data management are generally the PIs and their institutions that enter into agreements with us. Some larger projects also have data managers who share that responsibility, and some people also work with data coordinating centers, which also may share in this responsibility. So that was my quick overview. Now I'm going to hand things over to Sarah to lead us in our activity.
Thanks, Chelsea, and good morning, everyone. We're now going to give you the opportunity to work on drafting responses to a few of the elements that are required in an NIH data management and sharing plan. We're going to split into breakout rooms that will be assigned one data management and sharing plan element, and today we're focusing on elements 1, 4, and 5. Each group's assigned element will be the name of their group. Within your group, we ask that you discuss how you would respond to your assigned element if you were writing an NIH data management and sharing plan for the NIH reporter example study that we shared in the pre-workshop email and that I'll share again right now in the chat. You will have 10 minutes to work on the activity, and to maximize time, we suggest that you take a moment to open the links that I just shared so you're ready as soon as we go into the groups. We also ask that you assign a breakout room member to take notes and share out your group's responses with the full group once we come back together. I first want to thank you for participating in the activity, and I know it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing to do because it's a project that you're not familiar with and you're under a time constraint, but hopefully it at least gave you a sense for what you would be doing drafting your own data management and sharing plan. So with that, can I have someone from element 1, I think we only had one group for that, but share out what you came up with.
I guess I did most of the talking in the group, so I'll just go ahead and do the presentation. So I found there was 3 subparts under element 1, and I found I think the first 2 elements, A and B, in the abstract. So when I looked at the abstract, I could see their 4 aims, and that seemed to broadly fit the types and the amount of scientific data that they expected to generate with the project, and then how they were going to share that. They talked about the NChat and then leveraging, the IPM's data projects. And then I read somewhere, but I can't tell you where now, about their metadata that they were going to produce through code books and making them available as PDFs. So I would have to do a little bit more digging, I think, to figure that out. But given the time constraints and my not familiar with this particular thing, but again, I appreciate now I know the kinds of things that where I'm gonna start looking.
Thanks, Diana. And I would say that's exactly the kind of details that we would want the plans to include. Hitting on those 3, Kieran, if you can go to the next slide, hitting on those 3 sub-elements, if you will, the type and amount of data expected to be generated, how the data will be preserved and shared, and what documentation will be created and shared, as well as how the metadata will be shared. So with that, we came up with a sample response, knowing, of course, what we know about ICPSR, but using both the NIH reporter example as well as the ICPSR template. And you can see in bold some of the key pieces that you would want to be included. So we said we'll use population-based survey and time diary data collected from 35% of the NChat sample that had children under 18. The data would be de-identified, and deposited in Stata, plus a codebook and survey instruments will be preserved and shared. Direct identifiers will be removed prior to the deposit. Sensitive data will be managed using ICPSR's restricted data dissemination practices to ensure that data are kept confidential. Public versions of the data with identified disclosure risk mitigated will be made available to maximize usability while maintaining data security and privacy. Codebooks and other study documentation will be made available as PDFs on the ICPSR website. ICPSR will produce a codebook with full variable level details and frequencies for each quantitative data set, and will also release metadata about the project that adheres to the Data Documentation Initiative, or DDI, disciplinary metadata standard. So again, a lot of this is details that are in that sample template from ICPSR. And also, if you were to comb through the ICPSR site and look at the helpful pages about depositing data, as well as you can always reach out to us and use us as a resource when you're drafting your plan. But that's one example that we felt was strong for addressing element 1. And with that, we'll move on to element 4. And we did not have an element 4 group, so we can move on to what we see as a strong example there, which is the next slide. And features of a good example to element 4 include the names of the repository where the data and metadata will be archived. The response should tell about how the scientific data will be findable and identifiable, and also describe when and how long the scientific data will be made available. So in this strong plan example, we say the de-identified data, metadata, codebook, and survey instruments will be deposited with the ICPSR Social Behavioral and Economic Research on COVID-19 Consortium Coordinating Center, or SBE-CCC, for sharing and preservation. ICPSR is a core trust seal certified repository providing long-term access to and preservation of data packages curated by domain specialists. The data collection will receive a DOI, which is a globally unique and persistent identifier that is included in the citation and metadata record. Metadata will follow the DDI disciplinary metadata format and will be made available for bulk export in a variety of metadata formats. ICPSR permanently archives deposited files supporting the data through changing technologies, new media, and data formats. And one thing here I'd like to point out that both ICPSR and SBE-CCC are included in this response. If you plan to deposit your data with an NIH-funded archive at ICPSR, we recommend mentioning both the ICPSR in general and the specific archive name in your plan. This is especially important when the archive is funded by the same agency as your proposal. So for example, the project I work on, DSDR, is funded by NICHD. Plans submitted to NICHD could refer to the repository as DSDR at ICPSR. So that way NICHD is seeing the name of the archive they sponsor in your actual plan. Okay, next element. And I believe we have 2 groups here. So if I can get someone from group 1 to share out.
I think I was group 1. I'll just start talking and someone else can kick me off if not. So when we're talking about consent, things like that for access, distribution, or reuse, we saw first that these are very detailed demographics and very vulnerable populations that we're dealing with here. So referencing and making known IRB statements, things like that. The extent of where the data will be shared for informed consent, letting people know where it's going to go and what specific data will be shared, and the level of identifiability when we're talking about de-identified data that will be shared out potentially. And also if there is any controlled access that needs to be followed for depositing in the repository, any restricted distribution methods, confidentiality around that. And then we also talked a little bit about removing any direct identifiers perhaps, and talking about the curatorial services that could be provided to ensure that identifiers were restricted or removed if that was needed in this case. So yeah, we talked, I think, much about that, and yeah, that was pretty much it all we talked about there. So sorry if I was missing some things, but no, that's what we had.
That's great. Thank you. I think you touched on a lot of the key points that should be included. So I appreciate you sharing that out. Can we hear from group 2?
Think that was my group. So I'll just share next. We talked about we would include information that there, informed consent was collected. And then we noticed that the data that's already in ICPSR had some restricted use. So so some of it is more available than others. So we talk about the fact that some of the restricted use data needs an application to access the data, whereas other data would be shared without needing that necessarily, just registering through that. And those are the main things. So, and we agree with what the first group said too.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Catherine. You also hit on a lot of the key points that we would hope would be included in a strong response. So just to reiterate, a strong response would describe any factors that affect access, distribution, or reuse of the data, whether the access will be controlled, as well as protections for privacy rights and confidentiality of human research participants. Our example here that we came up with says human subject information will be fully de-identified before ICPSR disseminates it to the public. Access to information that may be used to identify human subjects, even if indirectly, will be managed according to ICPSR restricted use data access policy and procedures to maintain privacy and confidentiality protections of human subjects. Public data will be broadly accessible under ICPSR's terms of use. Data users will agree to make no attempt to identify human subjects, that they will cite the data in DOI, and that they will not redistribute the data without ICPSR written permission. Restricted access data will be further protected by terms set forth in a restricted data use agreement between the user's institution and ICPSR. Additionally, restricted data users must follow data security protocols, have IRB approval or exemption, take training, and meet other requirements prior to being approved to accessing the data. ICPSR offers tiers of access to restricted data based on data sensitivity, including a VDE. And with that, we have a few minutes for questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask about this activity specifically, I want to let you know that we're also going to have a longer period for questions at the end of the workshop. So maybe hold any questions that don't specifically relate to the activity, because the additional sessions between now and that ending question period may even get at what your current question is. So with that, anything, questions or even reflections on the activity that you just went through? Nothing. Certainly, I just want to say again that we are here to help. If you want feedback on a drafted plan, I can speak from the DSDR side of things, and NIH funded, that we have reviewed plans before. We encourage people to reach out to us even before they've drafted the plan to talk through how we can best support you through the process, and also how we can help you address special considerations and whatnot. So with that, in the slides, once you get them after the presentation, you'll see some FAQs as well as additional resources. For example, NICHD has a page where they have actually laid out some common issues that they see, as well as some suggested responses to those. So I encourage you to look at those slides once you get the actual presentation afterwards. But I think we are approaching time for break.
Yeah, thanks everyone for participating. It was probably unexpected, but I hope you learned something, got to interact with someone new. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. If you're on Eastern time, that's at, well, I'm on Central time, so in 10 minutes, regardless of your time zone, take a stretch, hydrate, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues, Aubrey and Catherine, to share a bit more about how to prepare for your deposit now that we've talked about the policy and let's say you have the data ready to go. So Aubrey and Catherine, I'll hand it over to you.
And good morning to everybody. I'm Catherine Baisden. I'm a data manager here at ICPSR. And
I'm Aubrey Garman. I'm a lead data curator here at ICPSR.
next slide, please. Why should data be shared? Well, some major things are that it's critical to the advancement of science. It demonstrates good stewardship, provides opportunities for testing theories, and it allows for replication. After months and years spent designing, collecting, and analyzing data, sharing your findings with the broader research community gives others the opportunity to build upon your initial vision. Data sharing fosters greater connection and collaboration among researchers, potentially leading to important new discoveries in the field. In a time of limited financial resources for science and research, sharing data is a more efficient approach, enabling researchers to maximize resources. Furthermore, data sharing increases research impact. There are studies that show that articles with shared data receive more citations, enhancing the visibility of the original work. Additionally, many funding agencies and academic journals are now requiring data preservation and sharing as conditions for grants and publications. Next slide, please. Sharing data here at ICPSR means depositing data. And at a minimum, ICPSR requires that the deposits include data files, documentation files, and descriptive information about the study and methodology. You also need, before you decide to deposit data, you also need to understand whether your informed consent or your IBR documentation allows for data sharing. And then you have a decision to make, whether you want to self-publish or do you want it to be curated. The key tip here is the more information you provide, the better. Supplying future users with comprehensive details greatly enhances the usability of your data. At ICPSR, there are two ways to archive your data: self-publication or curation. I will talk a little bit about self-publishing, and my colleague Aubrey will cover curation. When self-publishing, the data producer is fully responsible for both the data and associated documentation. The data is published in a format in which it is submitted without a formal review by the ICPSR curation staff. This means your data set becomes available to users almost immediately, and there is no cost to the depositor. However, it's important to verify whether self-publishing meets the requirements of your specific funding source. Next slide.
So at ICPSR, we aim to be data stewards of the research that you entrust with us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for curation at ICPSR. Much like an art or museum curator, data curators use the files and information that you provide in the deposits to make a data collection discoverable both now and in the future. In addition to creating preservation copies of all of the materials, we also will create multiple data formats to allow for equitable access. Perhaps most important to curation at ICPSR, which has already been touched on a little bit during this webinar, is that ICPSR will ensure that the data are being made available at the appropriate use level, so either public or restricted, in order to protect research participants. It's also important to note that curators do not analyze the data, and we're not your typical research assistants. Instead, think of us more as test users outside of your research team who can confirm that everything is what it needs to be before you share the data with the world. Next slide. More specifically, curators at ICPSR perform a number of quality assurance checks to make sure that the study materials are complete, valid, and meet archival standards. Different ICPSR projects have different priorities, budget constraints, and funding mechanisms, which will all feed into different decisions about how much curation effort can be afforded to any given deposit. So sometimes this means that we're reviewing every variable and page of documentation and then applying the prescribed level of curation enhancements. And sometimes it means just reviewing the minimum necessary for safe data sharing. In general, though, curation will check for issues of incompleteness in the data and then document them accordingly. As mentioned in the previous slide, data files will be standardized to allow them to be converted into multiple file formats. So with that, we would make sure that data deposited in, say, SAS meets the needed specifications in order to convert it into all of the other software programs. Variables can also be enhanced through curation, such as embedding question text into variable level metadata. And again, essentially, all curated studies are going to receive a thorough disclosure risk review, which is the phrase we refer to the process of reviewing for and resolving issues related to maintaining respondent confidentiality. Curation will also create study level metadata and compile related documentation using the supplied materials. So whether choosing to self-publish or to deposit for curation, the tips that Catherine and I are going to cover moving forward will be helpful to make any data collection understandable and usable for future users. Next slide.
Well, we're all coming on the holiday season and we're all thinking about baking. So I thought a baking analogy would fit this, this talk right now. I see baking analogy because it fits in relation to a data deposit. Just like baking, the experience is more enjoyable if you gather all your ingredients together before starting the process. Same is true in depositing your data. Look at your data form and gather your information. And if you have any questions about a specific items, please contact our support staff at ICPSR. Imagine you sit down to fill out a form, and then suddenly they are asking for obscure information, such as a list of your past addresses, exact dates, past salary information, tax records, your passport number. Then it becomes a hunt to find that information. I promise you that a deposit to the ICPSR archive will not ask such personal information, but the deposit form does request specific information, and I will go into detail later in this presentation about that. Look at the deposit form and gather all the information together, and I'm certain it will be a less frustrating experience. Next slide. Helping us understand the deposit at ICPSR, there are certain things that we look at that you might provide us with that would be helpful. Are there publication or promotion deadlines? Do you want to deposit your data as a public access or a restricted access database? There's terms of user agreements. There is the deposit that you're depositing now related to a past deposit by ICPSR, and are there any measures that are proprietary? I practiced that before. Are there any special circumstances that ICPSR needs to know in order to efficiently process your deposit? Any special instructions that could modify the manner in which it is processed? For example, if you're using some proprietary tests, you might need to get permission first from the appropriate authorities to deposit those measures or tests. Or you might have to make a decision not to deposit those measures at all. If a composite variable consists of the copyright measures, you may be allowed to deposit the composite variables, but not the individual variables that make up that composite. Intended access. Do you want your data to be publicly accessible? Are there any disclosure issues about personal information? And if you do have issues with disclosure risks, you may want parts of the data to be restricted, or you may want the entire data set to be restricted. If so, a restricted ICPSR data set requires individuals to apply, and those applications will be reviewed before access is granted. And we've touched on that earlier in the day. Our colleague Bianca will be speaking after this presentation in depth about these issues. Next slide.
In addition to giving us some of that kind of information, we need to understand the project. It's also important to consider the deposited files formats, naming, and organization. The slide lists some ideal and common formats we typically see at ICPSR, such as data in the more standard statistical programs of SPSS, Stata, or SAS. Just a heads up that when you are depositing data in SAS, it's helpful to include a formats catalog so that the data can be fully labeled, or including a setup file along with ASCII data so that it can be correctly read into one of the other standard statistical programs. We tend to see a little bit more variety in the types of documentation files, but more common formats include Word, PDF, and Excel. Being intentional in naming and organizing files can significantly impact how easily others understand and make connections between the associated data and documentation files. So for more complex studies, I strongly recommend using a nested folder structure like is shown in the example on the slide here, where the data and documentation are organized into separate folders, and then some subfolders can be used to further organize the different data types. You can also see in the example how clear file names can help to associate which documentation files belong to which data part. So we can logically make some assumptions that anything that begins with wave 1 are all related to one another. I also want to point out in the documentation subfolder here, there's a file inventory documentation, which is another helpful tool that depositors can use to help provide even more details on their study materials, which if you move to the next slide, here is an example of a file inventory. It lists all of the files from the deposit in one column, along with a few additional notes about what they may contain in the next column. The note column here provides information like who the interviews were conducted with and when, or how many cases are in the different SPSS files. As a curator, I absolutely love when deposits include this level of detail because it just makes organizing and understanding the files completely transparent and really easy to use. Next slide.
I'm going to continue with some data preparation tips. First, looking at variable names. Important clear variable names. Avoid periods or non-alphanumeric characters or starting names with a number because sometimes statistical packages don't allow that. If you're looking at a longitudinal study, plan for consistency, and that's an important word. Keep your variable names consistent over the waves. If you do change them, please provide in your deposit a variable crosswalk. And I can't emphasize that more than I have. That's an extremely important thing in longitudinal studies. Understand that some software packages do have limits on variable name length. Years ago, SAS had a limit of 8 characters, very small, but now I think it's 32. And there are different types of naming kind of patterns. One up is sort of just like variable 1, variable 2, variable 3. Question numbers is kind of associating it with the survey question, Q1, Q2, Q3. You have mnemonic numbers, names that are like date of birth, age. They have some kind of concise meaning in that mnemonic. And then you have ones that are based on either prefixes or roots or suffixes, where like educational variables, you might say, oh, Ed1, Ed2, or demographic, Demo 1 or Demo 2. Next slide, please. As important as a variable name is, the variable label gives you the depth. You might say the variable name is like a book cover, and then you turn in the book and there's all the detail here. Labels, please label all response options and categorical variables and avoid duplicate value labels. Consider your variable ordering and groupings, and be descriptive and have descriptive and unique variable labels. Clear, detailed descriptions are essential. While you are intimately familiar with your data after working with it for so long, future users will need as much guidance as possible. Variable labels offer an important opportunity to clarify the meaning of each variable. Be aware there are limits to the label length depending on the statistical package you use, so it's important to be direct and concise. Additionally, when including composite variables, be sure you clearly indicate that this not only in the variable label, but also in your documentation. Explain how each composite variable was constructed to ensure transparency and usability for future users. Next slide.
Since missing data can mean many different things, like a participant's refusal or uncertainty, a data error, or a logical skip, it's important to ensure that missingness is designated or, at the very least, labeled appropriately so that users can validate and replicate findings correctly. As I talked about earlier, it's also incredibly important to conduct disclosure risk reviews to de-identify sensitive data and protect participant confidentiality. While preparing your deposit, you'll want to make sure that your data complies with any consent forms and IRB requirements while still being analytically useful. This often involves removing or masking variables that contain direct identifiers or personally identifiable information like names, contact information, or other unique identifying numbers. Other confidentiality considerations may include removing the day component of non-administrative date variables or limiting open-ended text responses in public use data. If the data contain particularly sensitive or disclosive information that is still analytically important, consider making the data available with restricted access instead of public. And as a final data preparation tip, since we're all human and mistakes do sometimes happen, it's important to just check for general potential data errors. Common issues I find as a curator looking through frequency tables are typically the undocumented or out of range codes, or a mismatch between the labels embedded in the data file and their corresponding codes listed in the accompanying documentation. As experts of your research, you are more than well equipped of understanding the nuances of your data collection and ensuring that the data are valid and well documented. Which, speaking of documentation, if we move on, archive data are generally only as good as the metadata and documentation that accompany it. And that seems an obvious enough statement, but again, a common pain point I've experienced as a curator is just a lack of that information. It's important to start planning for documentation early in the project because preparing high quality, useful study materials can be time consuming. Preparing for documentation early will also allow you to more effectively begin to record important project and data related decisions in real time. Full study documentation that we encourage including in your deposit includes the types of materials here on the slide, like codebooks, the original data collection instruments or interview guides, user guides, README files or manuals, variable crosswalks for longitudinal data, consent forms, or any relevant syntax or programming code to use the data and replicate findings. As Catherine mentioned earlier, some scales and instruments may have special permissions for using and sharing item level details. So it's important to make sure that you're in compliance with those permissions while preparing materials for archiving. What I've often seen as a curator when we receive this type of information is that the data collected is reported at the aggregate level, and the documentation will sometimes only include a citation or instructions for how others can access or contact the owner of those scales. Overall, the documentation should be comprehensive and provide details about the research methods, participant characteristics, how the data were collected, any confidentiality measures, and any other information needed to access and use the data correctly, such as how to weight variables or how to link or merge the data. Next slide.
Metadata makes data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, usable. Metadata is a vital companion to your data set. Think of metadata as similar to the information you would see on a car's window sticker. It details important features as the model type, the year, the fuel efficiency, options, extras, price, and other essentials about the vehicle. Metadata provides the key details that help the user understand what is included in your data package. Next slide, please. On this slide, I'm giving you the elements that you will find on the deposit manager form and then eventually on the study home pages. Over under project description, these are things that you'll find on the form when you're trying to fill it out. Title, and we go title, time period, and location. For example, participation in adult education, 1969, United States. Project description. This is a summary of explaining the purpose and the focus of your study. It's an opportunity to give people a glimpse into what your study is about, who your study is about, what you're trying to achieve with your study. Principal investigators. please, you list your principal investigators, but please list them in the order that you would like to see them published. If you don't, and you decided, this is not the order I like, it takes a little bit of maneuvering to go back and redo that information. And also funding source, whether it's a federal agency or a foundation or any other funding source that you may have. Scope of project, this is under the metadata dome, you might say. Subject terms. These are terms that if you were going to search on the internet that could get you to your data set. It's very much like Googling on the internet now. Geographic coverage. This is where did the study take place? Was it in the United States? Was it in Italy? Was it in Kansas? That gives us an idea where this took place. Time periods. We can go back to the title I gave you, 1969. This may also be the same as the collection period. The universe, this defines what population that you studied. For example, participants in adult or continuing education who responded to the current population survey. Collection notes. This is, I think, a really important thing. It's an opportunity to give future users as much information as you possibly can about the process and how everything that went on in the design and the execution that can relate to your data set. Methodology, that's another item that belongs under the metadata dome. Response rates. That typically, please report response rates. If you had 100 surveys and you got 60, you got a 60% response rate. Sampling. Did we have a census? Did we have a stratified sample? Did we have a complex sample design? All these are very important when people begin to analyze their data, your data. Collection methods. There's many collection methods nowadays, but typically, was it a face-to-face interview? Was it a telephone interview? Was it a web-based survey? Units of observation, that can be individuals, that can be organizations, it can be households, it can be school districts, classrooms. Geographic unit, this is a specific level of geographic detail in the data. And then underneath is already the related publications that may have come out of this data. Important note is that our data deposit manager form will be changing in the near future. So I didn't want to go through a demo of the form itself, but these were all elements will appear on the form. Next slide, please. This is essentially a screenshot of one side, the deposit workspace is what you would see, and you can see all the terms that I just went over, some of the terms I just went over. And then after the curation is done, after it's published, on the other side, the study page. When somebody's coming to ICPSR to look up data, this is the kinds of what they will be seeing. So your information is being translated into the study page in the end. Next slide, please.
So in summary, when you're thinking about how to prepare your research for sharing, either through curation or by self-publishing, consider this question. What would someone else at any experience level from any research background need to know in order to use these materials? And that's what the data community needs from its data producers, and hopefully what we've shown a little bit of light on during this presentation. Next slide. Here, this slide, which you'll have access to later, contains links to several resources available through ICPSR and through some of our NIH-sponsored projects. And they provide even more details and can provide even more assistance with preparing your data for sharing. Next slide. And again, as always, if you have questions, ICPSR has a general help email that you can get assistance with. It'll put you in contact with the right people. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have some questions after our next presentation from Bianca, who's going to cover how to plan for restricted data sharing.
Hi, my name is Bianca Monson, and I'm the data. Oh, it looks like you're sharing. There we go. Okay. My name is Bianca Monzon, and I'm the Data Privacy and Security Manager for ICPSR's Privacy and Security team. Currently, I manage deposit and user agreement modifications in collaboration with our Office of Research and Sponsored Projects, and I also co-chair ICPSR's Restricted Data Dissemination and Access Committee, along with our Security and Privacy Officer, Joel Saw, who is joining us today and will be available during the Q&A section. This presentation will focus on planning for the collecting and sharing of restricted data, and I'll note that this presentation provides a quick overview of very complex topics, so please feel free to ask clarifying questions during the Q&A. We'll briefly revisit the differences between public versus restricted data, but this presentation will mainly focus on topics such as preparing for your IRB and consent forms, recommended data management practices for the collection of sensitive data, available ICPSR restricted data access systems for sharing your data, restricted data sharing agreements and regulations, and lastly, considerations for working with vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. The bulk of data deposited with ICPSR is public use data, which presents no risk to study participants. Restricted data, on the other hand, present higher risk of participant re-identification, either through direct identifiers such as names and social security numbers, or indirect identifiers, which are measures that when used in combination can lead to re-identification. Restricted use data limits data accessibility, but it protects respondent confidentiality. Next slide, please. Before you're able to collect sensitive data to begin your research, you'll need to prepare your IRB documentation and participant consent forms as required by the Common Rule. NIH abides by the Common Rule, which requires all federally funded research involving human subjects to comply with the federal policy for the protection of human subjects. The Common Rule establishes core procedures for protecting human research subjects, including requirements for informed consent and review by an institutional review board. The policy also addresses additional protections for vulnerable populations, which we'll discuss later in this presentation, and it provides a set of ethical principles researchers must follow to ensure the rights, welfare, and protection of study participants. So what qualifies as human subject research? Next slide, please. According to NIH and federal regulations, human subject research involves collecting, using, analyzing, or generating identifiable private information on living study participants. Next slide, please. NIH provides a decision tool to help you determine whether your research is human subject research, though you should always consult with your IRB. Again, human subject research requires IRB approval, though there are limited exemptions under the Common Rule. Next slide, please. An IRB ensures that your project is meeting ethical standards, institutional policies, and applicable regulations. When submitting an IRB request, make sure you identify the sample and universe for your study, include detailed information about your data management sharing plans, and provide information on the participant consent process. Note that while NIH no longer requires IRB approval prior to review and approval of your grant application, IRB approval is still required before the research can be funded and conducted. When reviewing your materials, the IRB will make its assessment based on the following criteria: whether the study is human subject research, whether vulnerable populations are being sampled, security measures in place that keep the data secure when storing or sharing the data, participant consent forms, whether the benefits of the research outweigh potential risks to study participants, and whether the project meets research ethics standards. Next slide, please. Thank you. If the IRB has determined that the research does not qualify as human subject research, or if the Common Rule indicates the research may be exempt from IRB approval, your IRB may provide an IRB exemption letter. Otherwise, the IRB will determine whether your study is rejected, and that may require you to incorporate some changes or approve based off of the criteria previously mentioned. IRB review is also required of ICPSR secondary data users, so when applying for data access, they go through much of the same process. Next slide, please. A consent form should outline the roles and responsibilities of both the researcher and the participant, and it should be written with clear and concise language that's easily understood by the signee. Provided are examples of participant and researcher obligations. When working with minors, you'll need to obtain consent from at least one parental guardian and obtain assent from the minor if applicable. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, previous slide. When drafting your consent forms, avoid consent language that indicates the data will be destroyed in the future or that promises no one outside your research team will see the data. Be transparent about the study purpose and intended use. Share your data management and sharing plans with study participants. For longitudinal studies, consider assent from minors with plans to update consent once they become of age. And lastly, disclose protections covered under your certificate of confidentiality. And there will be more on this later. I just want to emphasize before we start talking about collecting or preparing sensitive data to really avoid including language in your consent forms that again state that the data are going to be destroyed and that no one outside of your research team will see the data, because that defeats the purpose of depositing data with ICPSR and ensuring that it's accessible to secondary users. Okay, when working with sensitive data, it's important to be knowledgeable about best data management practices. Restricted data management practices focus on mitigating disclosure risk or the degree to which a data record can be linked to a specific person or organization. During the data collection stage, you can help reduce the risk of disclosure by only collecting information that is necessary, avoiding small sample sizes when possible, considering what demographic variables and level of geographic measures are being collected, using descriptive labels for your variable names and values, but not identifying labels. Use randomized synthetic unique identifiers. And lastly, consider the data you're collecting as qualitative and mixed methods data present unique challenges. Once the data have been collected, go back and check your labels for disclosive information. Check the data for direct and indirect identifiers and work to mitigate any identifiers while maintaining analytic value. You'll also want to ensure that your study documentation is aligned with the final data package and review that documentation to ensure that there aren't any identifiers in your study documentation. Next slide, please. Consider linking restrictions for linking data sets within your study or linking to data available elsewhere. You'll also want to think about any output guidelines you'd like to communicate to future users for responsible use of your data. And lastly, depositing your data with ICPSR ensures expert review and guidance on mitigating disclosure risk for your study, and curators are available to complete a disclosure risk assessment of the data. These services also extend to qualitative data that present unique disclosure risk concerns. Qualitative data requires significant time and effort to collect, so for this reason, the sample sizes for these studies tend to be smaller, and therefore they tend to pose more risk. Since the data is descriptive, responsive, respondents often lend identifiers in their responses. Mixed method studies also pose unique linking challenges, as the combined use of quantitative and qualitative data can sometimes increase the risk of indirect identifiers. Mitigating qualitative data is a tedious process that requires a close reading of all open-ended responses. It also requires investigating mentioned nouns to confirm that they cannot be traced back to a specific person, place, or organization. It's important to balance the need to protect respondent confidentiality with the need to maintain context for secondary users. So while it may be necessary to mask descriptive information, in most cases, it's better to recode the respondent's response and indicate as such. So here we have an example of the Roosevelt Rough Riders High School Marching Band being recoded to High School Marching Band to retain some context for the secondary user. And then again, you would want to indicate that that response has been recoded. We'll now discuss the secure systems ICPSR may use to disseminate your data. ICPSR has three main methods of sharing restricted data, and the access mechanism used to disseminate the data is mostly determined by the restriction level of your data. Our secure download system is recommended for restricted data where direct identifiers have been removed. The system allows data to be restricted use while still supporting accessibility to secondary users. So most of ICPSR's restricted data is secure download data. It requires an approved user application where the PI will provide information and documentation, such as their IRB determination letter and assigned user agreement. And I'll note that an application is a requirement for all three of our systems. In the application, the user must select one of our 3 data security plans available, which outline required physical and technical precautions the user must follow to keep the data secure. And 2 of our security plans require that the user's computer never be connected to the internet, while the private network option allows for limited internet connection, as the data are stored on a remote desktop controlled by the user's institution. The private network option requires additional review and approval by ICPSR's IT staff. So again, with the secure download option, the data are sent to the user via an encrypted link, and then they will download it into the location specified in their data security plan. Next slide, please. Our virtual data enclave system is recommended for data that are more sensitive. Our virtual data enclave is also a remote virtual desktop, but this environment is controlled and managed by ICPSR. Analysis output must be reviewed and approved by ICPSR staff, and the output is airlocked out of the secure environment by ICPSR once approved. So, counter to the secure download option where the user is responsible for vetting the output, we go through a vetting process for the output. And again, that information is extracted outside of our secure VDE system that's managed by our IT staff. Next slide. Our physical data enclave is our most secure system, but it greatly limits data accessibility as users must visit our Ann Arbor site to access the data. The system is recommended for data of the highest restriction level, and limited PDE studies may even contain identifiers determined necessary for analysis. The data are stored on a standalone computer in an isolated room in the ICPSR Perry basement, and users are limited to what they can bring into the PDE and what they may leave with outside of the PDE. Output for the PDE, like the VDE, is also vetted by ICPSR. We'll now discuss ICPSR's data deposit and sharing agreements and briefly touch on restricted data sharing regulations. The Restricted Data Deposit and Dissemination Agreement is an agreement between the data producers organization and the Regents of the University of Michigan on behalf of ICPSR. This agreement outlines the roles and responsibilities of both parties and including the secure transfer of the specified data package and consent from the data producer for the curation of their data. The agreement also establishes ownership and dissemination rights for the data and addresses procedures for breach reporting. Depending on the data's restriction level and the ICPSR archive that you're working with, a formal deposit agreement might not be necessary, as we also have a deposit system that includes deposit terms. You should consult with the project archive on what agreements are needed to deposit your data with ICPSR. Secondary users are also required to complete a data use agreement. Again, this is an agreement between the institutions and includes terms that outline the responsibility of ICPSR and the user's institution. This may include security measures and procedures for safe handling of the data, annual reporting requirements for the user, data breach requirements, and the process for securely terminating the user's research project. ICPSR recommends that data producers and users sign our agreements as is to avoid lengthy agreement negotiations between our institutions, but sometimes it may be necessary to modify these agreements to account for applicable laws and regulations. HIPAA regulations prevent protected health information from being disclosed without a patient's consent. ICPSR receives limited HIPAA data, but those data may require the addition of HIPAA terms to our agreements. Tribal laws protect tribal nations' inherent sovereign authority over data collection, ownership, and application of tribal data, and the tribal oversight would have to be accounted for in our agreements. Lastly, there are also international regulations to consider, such as the EU General Data Protection Regulations, known as some of the most stringent regulations in the world applicable to EU residents for our secondary data users. While these laws were created to protect respondent confidentiality, they don't necessarily restrict researchers from sharing data on sensitive topics or populations. Instead, these laws promote proper consent and they limit the sharing of identifiable information. Certificates of confidentiality, also known as COCs, are legal documents that are issued by NIH and other federal agencies to researchers that are collecting or using identifiable sensitive information. They apply to all data funded by NIH, and our user agreements included COC language to account for this. COCs afford additional protections to study participants and essentially prohibit researchers from disclosing the identity of study participants when compelled by federal, state, or local criminal or civil court proceedings. COCs have been challenged in court, but this rarely happens, and it's important to note that they may not always hold up in court. For example, if the Patriot Act is invoked due to a national security threat, the COC protections may not stand. If you receive a FOIA request or are subpoenaed at any point, it's important that you inform your legal counsel that a COC applies to the research. When working with vulnerable populations, there are special considerations for each stage of your research project, and we'll briefly go over a few recommendations. When working with vulnerable populations, the research requires high levels of communication, transparency, and collaboration. It's important to understand your obligations to ensure that these communities are protected and that you're meeting applicable regulations. When working with tribal nations, these communities will be involved in negotiations that shape the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of your project. You must establish memorandums of understanding and/or data use agreements that specify data collection practices, analysis, and dissemination policies and procedures. You must also obtain proper consent from study participants and familiarize yourself with FPIC terms that grant the rights of Indigenous peoples to provide, withhold, or withdraw consent from your study at any point. And you should establish procedures during negotiations for tribal board and oversight committee. For example, the American Indian and Alaska Native Head Start Family and Child Experiences Survey at ICPSR requires that secondary data users obtain tribal committee approval for their research before they're granted access to the data. NIH does support research on undocumented communities, though these communities, like tribal communities, present unique challenges. Provided are some recommendations for working with these communities from researchers in the field. Please note that these are not recommendations coming out of NIH. Like with tribal communities, you'll want to work with community members and organizations as research stakeholders. You should consider requesting a waiver of signed consent as opposed to a consent form from your IRB to ensure that study participants remain anonymous. And make sure that any documentation provided, again, considers language and format that's accessible to the participant. When collecting and storing the data, it's recommended that participants are assigned unique synthetic IDs, that the data be scrambled and split into multiple databases, which would require linking for use, and that each database be stored in separate secure locations. For longitudinal studies, one recommendation is to not retain contact information for follow-up, but to work with a community-based organization that is willing to retain and provide this information to you when needed. There are concerns about whether protections under the Certificate of Confidentiality apply to undocumented immigrants, so please be mindful of this. And lastly, you'll want to be transparent about your study's objectives and potential risks involved. While we've only discussed tribal and undocumented communities, many of these recommendations may be considered when working with other vulnerable populations. It's important that researchers understand their obligations for protecting respondent confidentiality throughout each stage of their data planning, collection, and sharing stages. And it's also important to note that the aim should never be to meet minimal requirements and regulations. Rather, NIH does encourage researchers to regularly consider research ethics throughout the research process. The links shared on the resource page are those tips for working with both of the vulnerable populations mentioned. And on our last slide is contact information if you need to follow up with me or our data privacy officer on any of the information shared.
Thanks, Bianca, for that thorough presentation. I learned so much just by listening to you. We've reached the end of all the presentations. We have plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to type any questions you have in the chat, or you're welcome to also unmute yourself, and we're happy to answer questions now.
Oh, hi. I'm Joe.
Joe.
Thank you guys for the info. As a new data management librarian, this is like very helpful in general, so I appreciate that. I guess I was just wanting to note something back on one of the links you guys sent in the original email, writing a data management sharing plan, the NIH one that has a big list of all the different institutes and their example templates for data management and sharing plans. Some of them are just wildly different in terms of their, examples or whatnot. Some are very short and stick to 2 pages. Some are long and, kind of don't observe 2 pages or, whatnot. So I guess it was more of a comment than a question, but it's just interesting to see sort of how everyone's dealing with this, and like what the landscape looks like between different agencies, between different institutes within an agency, stuff like that. So, and I'm sure you guys are aware of that too, but I don't know. I just wanted to provide that as a comment as I'm learning this landscape.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We've definitely noticed that some different funding agencies have some different requirements, and the information that we shared today is more generalized, but if somebody is applying to one of those specific agencies, they should definitely take a look at the resources available from that agency.
Totally, Chelsea. And just like a comment too, I mean, what is it in element 1 here? I don't know what institute I'm looking at, but they'll just say raw data files will be shared, period. And it's like, the level of example is definitely like varying, but I mean, at the same time, I understand there are different requirements. So, nope, just good learning moment here. Thank you.
Thanks for mentioning that, Joe. It does really vary. But as Chelsea said, that we are able to help, different researchers that are applying to different places. And I'm not sure which institution you're at, but we have a lot of data librarians, a part of our, we call them official representatives or designated representatives. So if you want to learn more about how to engage with that community through membership, feel free to reach out to our help desk. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Bianca, I had a question. What if my institution does not have an IRB?
So we get this question a lot, mostly from secondary data users, right? Because most of you guys have an affiliated institution where you're already going through the IRB process as part of the NIH requirement. But you can always outsource. You can always outsource if your organization doesn't have it. And then for our international users that come from countries that may not have an IRB, we have a process here at ICPSR to help determine whether there's an IRB equivalent that has some review and oversight over the ethics of their research, and that goes through an approval process, review and approval process here at ICPSR.
Thanks. It's helpful to know.
I just thought of something I wanted to add about Joe's question, or comment. So I was going to type it in the chat, but one thing to note is that it is like really entirely possible that a researcher might not have all the details so early in the process when they're up in the application stage. And so they may provide limited information and then decide later that they need to change their data management and sharing plan. And I think from NIH's perspective, the data management and sharing plan is meant to be a living document. And so you can definitely change it over time. And so I would advise people to provide the amount of information that they know at the time of their proposal, but then they can always work with their NIH project officer to revise the plan over time.
Really good point, Chelsea. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for sticking with us. We know we presented a lot of information, but hopefully things that will apply throughout the entire process for you and in your role and as you're conducting your research or supporting researchers. Again, these slides will be shared, the recording will be shared, and also I believe in the chat and the slides you'll see contact information if you have follow-up questions or need further support. But we hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for joining us.